In this video, we will look into the brutal stories behind the most heartless female police officers who murdered, humiliated, and devastated lives in the United States, and are currently serving punishments. We will cover their crimes, their service before jail, and their sentence. First on the list, Shauna Bishop. Shauna Bishop was not just any police officer. At 44, she served with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department and was a familiar, trusted face in her community. She was also a mother, a friend, and, unbeknownst to the public, a predator hiding in plain sight. In April 2019, suspicions emerged when a 16-year-old boy confided in his mother. She had found messages, text exchanges that were flirtatious and explicit. Her son admitted something no parent wants to hear: he had been sexually involved with Bishop. The boy wasn't a stranger to her. Bishop was a close family friend. Their families often spent time together, which granted her easy access to the teenager. On April 28, 2019, Bishop reportedly went to the boy's father's home in Folsom, where the physical encounter took place. She was off duty, but what happened that night had nothing to do with policing. It was a serious breach of trust, a criminal act involving a minor. The boy's mother reported the incident immediately, and within weeks, the Folsom Police Department and the Placer County Sheriff's Office opened an investigation, and by June 13, 2019, Shauna Bishop was arrested. The headlines were swift. A sheriff's deputy charged with sexual acts against a minor, an unthinkable betrayal by someone sworn to protect. The charges against Bishop included unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor, oral copulation, and contact with intent to commit a sex offense. Rather than contest the case in trial, Bishop and her legal team opted for a plea deal, likely to spare the victim from testifying and avoid a public spectacle. On August 5, 2020, Bishop entered a guilty plea to one felony count of unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. In exchange, the remaining charges were dropped. The sentencing, however, stirred public backlash. Bishop received 180 days in county jail, served on a work release program. She was also sentenced to 5 years of probation and ordered to register as a sex offender for life. To many, the outcome felt inadequate. The sentence seemed light, particularly given her role in law enforcement. Critics argued that her badge might have shielded her from harsher punishment. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Department issued a statement condemning her actions and confirmed she was no longer employed there. The victim, still a teenager at the time of sentencing, was left to navigate the emotional and psychological toll. The trauma of abuse, especially from a trusted adult, can carry lifelong consequences. For Bishop, the consequences extend far beyond legal punishment. Her name now appears on the public sex offender registry, a permanent reminder of her actions. Kim Potter. April 11, 2021, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. Kimberly and Potter, a 26-year veteran of the Brooklyn Center Police Department, was training a younger officer when she pulled over Dante Wright, a 20-year-old father of one, just outside Minneapolis. Wright had been stopped for expired registration tags, and officers soon discovered an outstanding warrant related to a prior weapons charge. As officers attempted to arrest him, Wright tried to re-enter his car, and what happened next would make headlines across the nation. Bodycam footage shows Kim Potter shouting, "Taser! Taser! Taser!" But instead of deploying her taser, she drew her Glock 9mm handgun and fired a shot into Wright's chest. He drove off, critically wounded, and crashed a few blocks away. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Kim Potter, visibly distressed on video, said, "I just shot him. I grabbed the wrong gun." The shooting came at a volatile moment, when the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd was underway. The city, already strained by racial tensions and distrust in law enforcement, erupted. Protests broke out across Brooklyn Center and surrounding areas, with calls for justice, accountability, and policing reform. The shooting was quickly labeled negligent homicide, and Potter resigned just days later, along with the city's police chief. What might have been a tragic accident, prosecutors argued, was actually criminal recklessness, a violation of public trust by someone who had trained officers for decades. In December 2021, Hennepin County Court, Minnesota. Kim Potter was charged with first-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence involving a firearm, and second-degree manslaughter, creating unreasonable risk. The prosecution argued that Potter's training, years of experience, and situational control should have prevented such a fatal mistake. The defense, meanwhile, said the shooting was tragic, but not criminal, that Potter mistakenly used her firearm instead of a taser in a high-pressure moment. But during the trial, the jury was shown side-by-side comparisons of tasers and handguns, both in size, weight, and position on her belt. Prosecutors hammered that point. Potter had been trained to know the difference. On December 23, 2021, after roughly 27 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on both counts of manslaughter. On Friday, February 18, 2022, Judge Regina Chu sentenced Potter to 2 years in prison, significantly lower than the state's recommended guideline of over 7 years. She cited Potter's clean record, remorse, and cooperation with the investigation. The lenient sentence sparked outrage from civil rights activists and Dante Wright's family, who argued that the punishment failed to reflect the value of their son's life. Kim Potter served 16 months in prison and was released in April 2023. The case triggered policy changes in Brooklyn Center, including revisions to use of force policies, a new department focused on unarmed community response, and greater oversight in police training. Potter, now a former officer and convicted felon, has kept a low profile since her release. She has expressed regret for her actions but maintained that the shooting was unintentional. Ivonne Wu. October 13, 2021, Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. NYPD officer Ivonne Wu, then 31, arrives at the home of her ex-girlfriend, Jenny Lee, a 23-year-old medical student. The two had recently ended a romantic relationship that had lasted about 2 years. But on that Wednesday night, Wu wasn't invited. Jenny had already moved on, dating Jamie Leong, a 24-year-old woman who was inside the apartment that evening. At around 5 p.m., shots rang out from inside the 19th Avenue residence. NYPD responded to a 911 call reporting gunfire. When officers arrived, they found Jamie Leong lying on the floor, shot in the chest, later pronounced dead at the scene. Jenny Lee was also shot but survived. Ivonne Wu was standing calmly outside the house. According to prosecutors and witness statements, she confessed on the spot, "I shot them both. The gun is inside." Investigators recovered her NYPD-issued firearm and determined the shooting was not in the line of duty, but rooted in personal motive, a crime of jealousy and obsession. Wu allegedly waited inside the home for hours before ambushing the couple. Wu was immediately arrested and charged with second-degree murder, attempted murder, criminal use of a firearm, and burglary. Her actions stunned the city, not just because of the violence, but because she was one of their own, a 5-year veteran of the NYPD's 72nd Precinct. After nearly 3 years in custody at Rikers Island awaiting trial, Wu struck a plea deal with prosecutors. In July 2024, she formally pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter for the killing of Jamie Leong and second-degree attempted murder for the shooting of Jenny Lee. Brooklyn Supreme Court Justice Danny Chun presided over the sentencing. On July 19, 2024, Ivonne Wu was sentenced to 27 years in state prison, 23 years for the manslaughter charge, and 4 years for attempted murder, to be served consecutively. She showed no visible emotion during sentencing. The courtroom was filled with friends and family of both victims. Jenny Lee, who survived the shooting, delivered a tearful statement, "I trusted you. I loved you. You tried to kill me because I moved on." There was no jury trial. The plea deal spared both families the trauma of drawn-out testimony, but left haunting questions unanswered. What snapped in Officer Wu that night? Was it planned, or impulsive rage? The case of Ivonne Wu remains one of the most disturbing examples of personal vendetta intersecting with police power. As of 2025, Wu is serving her sentence in a New York State women's correctional facility, stripped of her badge, her career, and the life she once knew. Internal policy reviews in the NYPD followed, particularly regarding firearm access and off-duty mental health protocols. For the Asian American community in Brooklyn, the tragedy left scars due to both victims and the perpetrator being young Asian women. Activists called attention to the need for mental health resources and healthy breakup support. Christina Hami. February 2011, Avondale Estates, Georgia. It was mid-morning when Officer Christina Hami, off-duty but still in uniform and behind the wheel of her DeKalb County patrol cruiser, sped through the streets of Avondale Estates. She wasn't responding to a call, and she wasn't chasing a suspect. She was reportedly headed to lunch. Eyewitnesses and traffic data later confirmed, Christina's vehicle was traveling at over 70 miles per hour in a 35 miles per hour zone, with no lights or sirens activated. At the intersection of Kensington Road and Covington Highway, as she came around a curve, Hami's cruiser suddenly veered into oncoming traffic. A silver sedan carrying 51-year-old Cheryl Burton and her friend Shelley Amos was traveling in the opposite direction. In an instant, the two vehicles collided. Head-on. Violent. Devastating. Both women were killed instantly, pinned in their crumpled car. Hami's cruiser spun and came to a stop, heavily damaged, with the officer herself injured but conscious. Debris was scattered across the roadway. Nearby residents rushed out, confused by the sound, only to find a scene of destruction. Emergency crews arrived, but it was already too late for the victims. What should have been a routine lunch run had turned into a deadly crash, caused by an officer sworn to protect, now at the center of a tragedy she never saw coming. On February 5, 2015, after nearly 4 years of pretrial proceedings, Christina Hami, aged 28, finally accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of vehicular homicide, reckless driving, and violation of oath of office. Under the plea agreement, Hami was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but with only 3 years to serve behind bars. The remaining 7 years were suspended, contingent on probation and good behavior after release. She surrendered immediately to begin serving her sentence. The crash and its aftermath sparked widespread outrage. The families of Burton and Amos received settlements from DeKalb County for wrongful death. Public trust eroded as residents questioned whether an officer was being privileged for holding a badge rather than punished for reckless behavior. Institutional repercussions followed. DeKalb PD initiated internal reviews on off-duty conduct, enforcement of speed policies, and proper use of emergency equipment. Rebecca Hillman. November 22, 2020, Manhattan Detention Complex, New York. 29-year-old Ryan Wilson had been detained for months, awaiting trial on nonviolent charges. Though not considered high risk, Wilson had a documented history of mental health struggles, including depression and suicidal ideation. According to internal records, he had clashed with another inmate days before the incident. That altercation led jail officials to approve his transfer to a different housing unit, a decision meant to ensure his safety. But paperwork delays and staffing shortages stalled the move. During that window, on November 22, 2020, Wilson reached his breaking point. Captain Rebecca Hillman, then 38, had returned to active duty after a stress-related leave of absence. According to later testimony, she had been under immense pressure, juggling long shifts, staff shortages, and institutional dysfunction. Her colleagues described her demeanor as increasingly detached. One officer testified that Hillman had recently returned not quite herself, emotionally closed off, irritable, and reluctant to engage. That afternoon, Hillman was supervising Wilson's unit when he became agitated. He began shouting that he wouldn't survive the wait for transfer. Minutes later, he tied a bedsheet into a noose, climbed onto a stool inside his cell, and made a chilling threat. An officer nearby radioed Hillman for help. But when she arrived, she chose not to act. And what followed was not a chaotic emergency, but a quiet, preventable death unfolding in real time. Wilson gave warnings. He counted down, and then he jumped. Officers on scene requested immediate entry, but Hillman, believing it was a manipulative gesture, ordered the cell to remain closed. By the time she gave permission to open the door, 15 minutes later, Wilson had lost consciousness. Efforts to resuscitate him failed. In a place where urgency should have been instinct, Hillman hesitated. That hesitation, layered with stress, institutional fatigue, and human misjudgment, proved fatal. On March 14, 2023, inside the New York State Supreme Court, prosecutors brought one count of criminally negligent homicide against Hillman, the first ever such conviction of a New York corrections officer. After a two-day jury deliberation, she was found guilty. On April 28, 2023, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg announced, Hillman would serve 6 months in jail, plus the standard period of conditional release. The verdict and sentencing followed public scrutiny and internal investigation. Hillman had been acquitted of falsifying official paperwork. In court, Wilson's sister described her brother's tragic struggles with mental illness and institutional neglect, and criticized Hillman's inaction as irreversible. Hillman, emotionally strained, testified she believed Wilson's threat was a ruse and that she had returned to work from recent medical and emotional leave. The Department of Corrections faced pressure to revise suicide prevention protocols and emergency response training. Internal investigators warned that Hillman's behavior reflected systemic deficiencies rather than isolated error. Gina Mestre. Summer 2020, Bronx, New York City. Gina Mestre, aged 33, was a New York City Police Department officer, assigned to the Public Safety Unit of the 52nd Precinct in the University Heights section of the Bronx. Mestre had served from July 2013 to May 2022. Her precinct was charged with curbing gun violence, largely perpetrated by the Shooting Boys gang, whose leader was Andrew Caballo Dunn. In June 2020, Mestre began a secret, intimate relationship with Andrew Dunn. As the gang fell under the scope of a federal grand jury probe into racketeering and violent crimes, Mestre covertly passed him confidential, non-public law enforcement intel, impending indictments, planned raids, and identities of cooperating witnesses. She even leaked a surveillance video showing Andrew Dunn committing a murder. Andrew used that head start to dispose of weapons, intimidate witnesses, and evade arrests, eventually fleeing the country. Shockingly, Mestre had identified him as the shooter in the investigation, only to betray investigators by sending him the tape. The woman who identified the killer was secretly feeding him evidence, and enabling his escape. On December 7, 2023, U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. Mestre pleaded guilty to one count of accessory after the fact to murder in aid of racketeering, admitting she obstructed justice and helped a murder suspect evade capture. U.S. District Judge Denise L. Cote accepted her plea. On March 29, 2024, in Manhattan Federal Court, Mestre was sentenced to 70 months in prison, roughly 5 years and 10 months, followed by 2 years of supervised release, for her role in obstructing federal law enforcement efforts. She had allegedly betrayed her oath, and the public trust, by aiding a known violent criminal. U.S. Attorney Damian Williams declared. She abused her position as an NYPD officer, serving both as an identifier of the murderer and his escape planner. Mestre's downfall became a case study in internal corruption and police oversight. The NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau and the U.S. Attorney's Office jointly investigated and exposed these violations. The case shocked the Bronx community and raised critical questions. How could an officer investigating a gang feed it insider intelligence? Why was internal oversight insufficient to prevent such a breach? Mestre's conviction also empowered the prosecution of other members of the Shooting Boys gang, including Andrew Dunn. He later pled guilty to racketeering and murder, and he received 35 years in prison. Amber Guyger. September 6, 2018, Dallas, Texas. It was just after 10 p.m. when Amber Guyger, a 30-year-old off-duty Dallas police officer, returned home from a long shift. She parked on the fourth floor of her apartment complex, Southside Flats, the same floor she always used. Except this time, she wasn't on her floor. She had parked one level above, and unknowingly walked into apartment 1478, not 1378, her actual unit. The door was slightly ajar, the lights were off, and inside sat Botham Jean, a 26-year-old accountant, watching TV and eating ice cream in his own home. Guyger drew her service weapon. According to her later testimony, she believed she had encountered a burglar. She shouted commands. Jean stood up, and within a few seconds, she fired 2 shots, striking him once in the chest. Botham Jean collapsed. Guyger immediately called 911, pacing the hallway outside. "I'm going to lose my job," she was heard saying. "I thought it was my apartment." Paramedics arrived, but it was too late. Jean was pronounced dead at the hospital. The case ignited fury. Botham Jean was unarmed, sitting on his own couch in his own apartment when he was killed. He was a native of St. Lucia, a graduate of Harding University, and a respected employee at PricewaterhouseCoopers. His only crime? Living in the apartment directly above Amber Guyger's. As news of the shooting broke, critics questioned the plausibility of Guyger's explanation. How could a trained officer not realize she was in the wrong unit? Why was her gun drawn before confirming a threat? And most crucially, why was deadly force the first response? The Dallas Police Department handed the case to the Texas Rangers. Guyger was placed on administrative leave, and within days, charged with manslaughter. But as public pressure intensified, that charge would change. In September 2019, Dallas County Court. Amber Guyger's trial began nearly a year after the shooting. By that time, the charge had been upgraded to murder. The prosecution argued that Guyger acted unreasonably, that she missed clear signs that she wasn't in her own apartment. A bright red doormat that wasn't hers. A different floor entirely, furniture, and layout that did not match her unit. More damning, they argued, was her decision to shoot rather than retreat or call for backup. Guyger, they said, chose to use lethal force without verifying her surroundings, a fatal decision that cost a man his life. The defense argued that the shooting was a tragic mistake, not murder. Guyger testified in her own defense, saying she feared for her life and truly believed Jean was an intruder. But the jury didn't buy it. On October 1, 2019, after 5 days of testimony and less than 24 hours of deliberation, Amber Guyger was found guilty of murder. The following day, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The moment that made headlines wasn't just the verdict, but what happened after the sentence was handed down. Brant Jean, Botham's 18-year-old brother, took the stand. He told Guyger he forgave her. And then, in a moment that shocked the courtroom and the nation, he asked to hug her. The judge allowed it. The two embraced. The room went silent. It was a scene of profound emotional complexity, mercy, grief, justice, and humanity colliding. Amber Guyger's case remains one of the most widely debated police shooting trials of the 21st century. To supporters of reform, the murder conviction of a white police officer for killing an unarmed black man was seen as rare and necessary. To others, especially in law enforcement, the case raised concerns about criminalizing human error. But for Botham Jean's family, the trial was only part of the journey. They launched the Botham Jean Foundation, supporting causes he cared about: education, community, and faith. His name joined a growing list of black men whose deaths became symbols of the urgent need for police accountability. Guyger's conviction did not end with sentencing. In 2021, her appeal to overturn the murder conviction was denied. As of 2025, she remains incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit, a women's prison in Gatesville, Texas. She had been eligible for parole in September 2024, after serving half of her sentence. Stephanie Lazarus. February 24, 1986, Van Nuys, California. On a quiet Monday morning in the Van Nuys neighborhood of Los Angeles, a man named Nels Rasmussen received a phone call that would change his life. His daughter, Sherry Rasmussen, a 29-year-old critical care nursing director at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, had been found dead in her condo. She had been beaten and shot 3 times. The scene was staged to look like a burglary. Her husband of just 3 months, John Rutan, arrived home to find her body. LAPD investigators theorized that 2 burglars had entered through the sliding glass door, and when Sherry confronted them, she was killed. But that theory didn't sit right with Sherry's family. Privately, Nels Rasmussen had always suspected someone else, Stephanie Lazarus, an LAPD officer and John Rutan's ex-girlfriend. Stephanie had dated John in college, and according to family and friends, she had a hard time letting go. Even after John and Sherry married, Stephanie showed up unannounced at John's office, confronted Sherry, and once allegedly told her, "If I can't have John, no one else will." But back in 1986, police never investigated Lazarus seriously. In fact, because she was one of their own, the case went cold. For over 2 decades, Lazarus moved up the ranks in the LAPD, eventually becoming a detective in the art theft detail. The murder of Sherry Rasmussen remained an unsolved file in the archives, until 2009. That year, LAPD's cold case unit took another look. Advances in DNA testing allowed them to re-examine evidence taken from a bite mark on Sherry's arm. Saliva was tested and revealed female DNA, ruling out the original theory of male burglars. When that DNA was cross-referenced in a departmental sweep, one name quietly emerged as a possible match: Detective Stephanie Lazarus. To avoid tipping her off, Internal Affairs staged an elaborate ruse. Officers discreetly collected a discarded Starbucks cup from Lazarus during a stakeout. The DNA from the cup matched the bite mark. On June 5, 2009, Lazarus was arrested at LAPD headquarters. She was charged with the first-degree murder of Sherry Rasmussen. On March 8, 2012, in Los Angeles County Superior Court, after a highly publicized trial, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder. Prosecutors had built a timeline of obsession and jealousy. They presented evidence of her past relationship with John Rutan, her confrontations with Sherry, and most damning, the DNA evidence. The jury was shown how Lazarus, an LAPD officer with access to crime scene protocols, had staged the murder to appear like a burglary gone wrong. Prosecutors argued that she entered the Rasmussen home while John was at work, shot Sherry 3 times, beat her with a blunt object, and then left the scene carefully masked as a home invasion. At sentencing, Sherry's father, Nels Rasmussen, addressed the court, "She stole my daughter, and then she wore a badge for 23 years." The judge, Robert Perry, sentenced Lazarus to 27 years to life in prison. She was remanded to the California Institution for Women in Chino. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus sent shockwaves through the LAPD and law enforcement communities nationwide. Here was a decorated officer, someone trusted to uphold the law, who had committed murder, then concealed it for over 2 decades from within the very system meant to bring her to justice. The case raised troubling questions. Did Lazarus have help hiding the crime? Why wasn't she investigated more seriously in 1986? Did LAPD's blue wall protect one of their own? It also spotlighted the growing power of DNA evidence in cold cases, showing how a single strand of genetic material, preserved for decades, can change everything. Sherry Rasmussen's family finally received the justice they had been denied for 26 years. But it came with a bitter truth: the woman who killed their daughter carried a badge, wore a uniform, and operated in plain sight all that time. Stephanie Lazarus remains behind bars. Her parole was denied in 2023, and her next hearing is expected in the early 2030s. Valerie Cincinelli. Early 2019, Nassau County, New York. Valerie Cincinelli, a decade-long 36-years-old NYPD officer assigned to the 106th Precinct in Queens, previously the domestic violence specialist and later transferred to a camera monitoring unit after personal incidents. Estranged from her husband, Isaiah Carvalho Jr., amid bitter divorce and child custody battles over their son, Valerie had increasingly volatile involvement with her boyfriend, John DeRubba, a much older man with a past of criminal accusations. In February 2019, she gave DeRubba $7,000 in cash, allegedly to hire a hitman to kill both Carvalho and, remarkably, DeRubba's teenage daughter, allegedly driven by jealousy. DeRubba instead contacted the FBI, becoming a confidential informant and wearing a recording device. The plot was secretly recorded. In a dramatic ruse, the FBI staged Carvalho's apparent death and showed Valerie a staged photo. She reacted by instructing DeRubba to delete the files and create a false alibi. She discussed ways to divert suspicion, fully captured on audio and video. At each point, what seemed like romantic turmoil morphed into calculated, recorded conspiracy. The blue badge concealed a dark domestic obsession. On April 16, 2021, in federal court on Long Island, Valerie Cincinelli formally pleaded guilty to one count of obstruction of justice, admitting she deleted evidence to impede the murder-for-hire investigation. Other more serious charges, like conspiracy to commit murder, were dropped in the plea deal. During the plea hearing, she emotionally cried, "For 2 years, I haven't seen my son. I know what I did was wrong. I'm truly sorry." On October 29, 2021, Cincinelli was sentenced to 48 months in federal prison. The judge upheld prosecutors' agreement not to exceed 5 years. By then, she had already served approximately 30 months. She became eligible for home confinement after roughly 6 additional months. Verdict: guilty of obstruction of justice, receiving a 4-year prison sentence. She resigned from the NYPD in March 2021. The case shattered public trust in how some officers might exploit their authority, a sworn protector allegedly ordering the assassination of her own spouse and a teenager. The story went public via a Dateline NBC exposé in 2024. John DeRubba, her ex-boyfriend and intended facilitator, became a reluctant hero, exposing the plot to the FBI, turning cash into gold coin payments, wearing a recording device, and providing undercover footage and recordings. Those led directly to her arrest. The department re-examined domestic violence unit eligibility, internal supervision, and how officers with unstable personal lives are handled, especially when they're responsible for public safety. Ashley MacArthur. September 8, 2017, Pensacola, Florida. Taylor Wright, a 33-year-old former Jacksonville police officer turned private investigator, mother to a young son, and a determined woman embroiled in a disputed $100,000 settlement, was last seen alive after spending the day with her friend Ashley MacArthur, a former crime scene technician turned businesswoman. Taylor's girlfriend reported her missing later that evening. MacArthur claimed Taylor had grown emotional and left alone to think, but there was no Uber receipt, no trace of Taylor beyond MacArthur's statements. 6 weeks later, searchers combing through a wooded area behind a farm owned by MacArthur's family uncovered Taylor's remains, encased in concrete and potting soil. A missing bullet charm necklace confirmed her identity. Taylor had been murdered, shot in the back of the head. Investigators discovered MacArthur had deposited a $34,000 cashier's check, made out to Taylor, into her own account and spent it. Surveillance footage revealed MacArthur purchasing concrete and potting soil the day after Taylor disappeared. Friends testified that MacArthur had joked about spiking Taylor's drink with cocaine, then escalating to more sinister alternatives if that didn't work. When that failed, MacArthur allegedly shot Taylor instead. That is, a crime scene expert used her training to eliminate evidence, shoveling dirt, pouring concrete, burying a friend and concealing justice. In August 2019, Escambia County Court, Florida. Charged with first-degree premeditated murder, MacArthur also faced separate fraud and racketeering charges for defrauding local bar owners through her family's jukebox and pool table business. At trial, prosecutors laid out the motive. Taylor needed that money for child support and legal fees, and MacArthur had spent it. Cell tower records placed MacArthur at the family farm, not the equestrian trails she described. Financial documents revealed the cashier's check was deposited, spent, and concealed. Her defense argued lack of direct physical evidence linking MacArthur to the shooting, and that Taylor had behavioral issues. but after a week of testimony, the jury sided with prosecutors. In August 2019, MacArthur was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with a mandatory minimum of 25 years. She had already been sentenced earlier in 2019 to 7 years for fraud and racketeering. Appeals filed in April 2021 were denied, including claims about prejudicial evidence and jury instruction errors. The First District Court upheld the conviction and sentence. The MacArthur case reverberated deeply in Florida's criminal justice community. It overturned assumptions. A trained crime scene technician, who knew how evidence worked, used that knowledge to conceal murder. Taylor Wright's circle remembered her as courageous, sprightly, and determined. The Dateline episode, The Necklace, featured the case in 2021, reviving public focus on the heartbreak of her loss and the manipulation behind it. As of mid-2025, Ashley MacArthur remains incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution, Florida, serving multiple concurrent sentences. Thank you for following all through this case. If you like this video, and want to see more like this, where we cover true crime documentaries, deep-rooted in the legal system, then I would be more than happy to see you subscribe to this channel. Like this video, and hit the bell icon to get notified when the next video drops tomorrow.